This is Fireside Chats, the Roosevelt Institute's weekly Blogging Heads show, where we discuss some of the most important progressive issues that relate to building a new deal for the 21st century. I'm Bryce Covert. I work at the Roosevelt Institute editing our blog, Next New Deal. And today I'm very excited to be joined by Nancy Folbre, who I will have introduce herself.
Hi, I teach economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I've been working with a team of researchers funded by the Russell Sage Foundation, and we've just published an edited book called For Love and Money, Care Provision in the U.S.
Yes, and in fact, I'm going to hold up the cover because I have a copy.
Great.
This is the new book, and it's really great. I'm really excited to talk to you about it, and I think it's interestingly very relevant to some of the headlines going on right now.
It definitely connects to current events, yeah.
Yeah, it's good timing. And so I wanted to start out talking about that a little bit. You should give an overview of the book. I'll summarize it a little bit, which is to say that what I find interesting about the book, and it seems like one of the projects of it, is to talk about care work not just as domestic workers, not just as nursing home attendants, not just as women taking care of their children for unpaid labor in their homes, but to look at it as a comprehensive thing. I think those things tend to be somewhat siloed, and we talk about them in different ways. And it seems like one of the projects of the book is to talk about all care work all together and to look at the way we support these policies and don't support them.
Yeah, that was really the motivating idea, and I feel like there some really good synergies have come out of it, that we've combined people who know a lot about childcare with people who know a lot about elder care, and people who know a lot about paid care work with people who know a lot about unpaid care work. We did sort of set aside the healthcare industry because we felt like that was a huge topic in of itself, but in terms of hands-on face-to-face care of dependents other than healthcare, I think we've provided a really good unified picture.
Yeah, I think so. I have to say, I think of myself as someone who works in this area a lot, and I began reading it, and when you brought up foster care, I was just sort of like, oh, of course. But I never, when I'm writing about this and thinking about this, I rarely think about foster care work.
Foster care is a really great example because, of course, it's work that's really important. It's work that is really on the boundary between paid and unpaid work. Foster parents are trying to do what regular parents do as best they can. They're not getting very much financial support for what they do, and they're really caught in that kind of care contradiction of where a lot of people think there's a trade-off between love and money and are reluctant to pay foster care parents more precisely because they're afraid that will have some negative effects.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about it. People who are not related, who take on foster children, do usually get some compensation, although, as you point out, it's not very much. But in some ways, we think of that a little bit like a job. But then if you think about kin who are related to foster children, we just think of that as, oh, well, they're just taking care of children, which in general, this country thinks of taking care of children as something that people just do. And when we say people, usually it's women.
Yeah, it really shows you that continuum between paid and unpaid care and how there's no bright line often between the two.
Exactly. And another big takeaway I had from the book is thinking about how to value care and in all of the meanings of that. I mean, there's the way of just, there's a lot of discussion of how do you actually measure it and what are you measuring, and therefore how do you then put a value on it. And I think you have consistently made arguments, and in this book you make an argument that there is a value to this care work to everyone, to the economy, to individuals, and there's a cost when we're not valuing this care. And to relate it to the headlines, what I'm curious about hearing from you is that, last week Jerry Brown, the governor of California, vetoed a bill to give labor rights to domestic workers in California. And then, in New York, we've had this big push for paid sick days that has been continually blocked by Christine Quinn and both of them are being pressured pretty heavily by the business industry and the business lobby. So is there a way in your mind to make the economic case, to bring business in, or at least to be able to combat their claims that, oh, well, it's too much of a cost burden on us to do these things?
Yeah, I think I'm very focused on ways of trying to make the business case, and I think there actually is a pretty strong business case that the business community does have a stake in the long-run health and well-being of its labor force. And enabling low-wage workers to be able to do a good job and also to be able to fulfill their family responsibilities more successfully yield some really important social benefits. I also think experience has shown that employers are often very nervous about the initial introduction of regulations of this type, but once they're in place, they often yield some unexpected benefits, and sometimes those benefits take the form of reduced turnover on the job and reduced training costs, and just things running more smoothly. A lot of businesses, for instance, with respect to sick leave, benefit from having their customers know that workers are going to stay home when they're sick instead of going to show up and be contagious, as it were.
Definitely. There's also, there's studies behind all of that too. I've definitely seen IWPR has done a lot of work looking at, I think it's Seattle. I think there's another study.
Yeah, San Francisco is the case that's been studied more, although Seattle also has a law in place. And yeah, in the wake of the law, IWPR did a survey, and a lot of the businesses surveyed, way more than half felt fine with it, like it was a good change.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and there's signs that it could even be beneficial, as you're saying, increased productivity.
Yeah.
So I do think that there's a case to be made. I wonder what that initial hesitation is about. And I've had conversations with some people who work in the private sector and sort of the more business side of things, who say that there's this disconnect between what small business owners or regular business owners think and their represented interests, like the Chamber of Commerce, which tends to be very conservative, even in policies that might actually benefit small businesses. So I don't know. I wonder if there's either a disconnect between the businesses themselves and what they will actually feel from this, and what is being represented in the organized lobbying of our officials.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I'm really fascinated by the small business sector in the U.S. For a long time it has been very allied with what we think of as big business, and I think the Chamber of Commerce itself kind of reflects that kind of coalition. But, times are changing, and a lot of big businesses are very heavily invested outside of the U.S. They're increasingly reliant on sales outside the U.S., on facilities outside the U.S., and on workers outside the U.S. And what that does is it drives a little bit of a wedge between big business and small business. Small businesses are local. They depend on their local workers, and they care about the well-being of their local community. And I think that, I guess my prediction is that in the next few years we're going to see small businesses moving in a much more independent direction.
Yeah, that would be fascinating, and to see maybe small business associations joining this cause and maybe even breaking with the big business lobby. That's a really good point.
Yeah, you can see evidence of this in the growth of kind of buy local campaigns, the increasing support for local credit unions, community-supported agriculture. There's a whole kind of localist movement underway in the U.S., and I think it's very closely aligned with the focus that we try to develop on care work. To me, care for people, care for children and people who are disabled or sick and the elderly, it's sort of like caring for the environment. It's something that's not directly a part of the market economy, but the market economy really, really depends on it. And I think that the new localism is very oriented at that.
Yeah, and of course, care work is a perfect example of this too, because part of the reason jobs are growing in this industry is because you can't outsource them. I mean, you can't get childcare from someone who's in another country.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is going to be very local work. This is going to serve communities at a very local, irreplaceable level. So hopefully that will sort of be the cement and the glue between the providers and the people they provide to and the businesses in that area, and everybody will sort of be on board together.
Yeah.
Maybe. So speaking of getting people glued together and cemented together, obviously one of the projects I think that comes out of your book is how do we build a coalition. I mean, you paint a very clear picture that care work and care policy is a vast network, that it includes lots of things, it impacts people in very different ways and has a different impact on different income groups, for example, or people who live in different geographies. People have very different needs for care work and expectations for it. So do you have thoughts about how you begin to build a coalition? Because I think, for childcare, for example, I think one of the challenges is that parents of young children care quite a lot, but you only have young children for usually a sort of short amount of time. So it's hard to sort of build a long-term movement around them.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, that's why concepts or phrases like the care economy or the care sector or care policy are really important, because they kind of they get people to start kind of conceptualizing the connections between what children need and the elderly need and what people who are sick or disabled need. And they also kind of help break down this dichotomy between paid work and unpaid work, the family and the market. I think there's a tendency for people to think, well, or at least part of our political discourse kind of holds that it's okay to be perfectly self-interested and profit-oriented in the market, because once you go home, that's where you can be caring and loving and altruistic. And in some ways, the point of our larger analysis is that you can't be one way in one place and the other way in the other. We need to have a different kind of balance between self-interest and care for others. It's got to inform public policy everywhere.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point, too, that intrinsic motivation, as you call it, sort of feeling altruistic or caring about the work you do or the people that you work with, is not unique to care work. It definitely is a big facet of care work, but it can motivate workers to be more productive across the board. We just don't really think of it that way.
Yeah, that's right.
Most work being motivated by money.
Yeah, we really, and I do think there's some work in management and organization theory and management theory that's actually taught in a lot of business schools now about the complementarities between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. That for any business, for any economy, figuring out a way to reward people and for pursuing intrinsically valuable goals and reinforcing that is a really good strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So if you think about building this vast coalition that we need to bring people together and talk about care work in a very sort of unified way, is there anything either going on right now that you see as maybe like a first step towards this, or a promising sign of this, or a place that's good to focus to get this going? Because it feels like it is, I think, a pretty large project, but if we start sort of in a small place, do you think there's a place to focus that leads to the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of grassroots organizations that are now trying to move into this opening, as it were. One of them is the Caring Economy campaign that recently publicized 6 questions for the presidential candidates, trying to get them, trying to put a little bit more pressure on the national political discussion to engage with these issues. Generations United is another kind of grassroots group. I love its name. Trying to get away from pitting the needs of children against the needs of the elderly. So I think there have also been efforts of these groups to get together and kind of calibrate and unify their message. So I think it's a happening. I think it's a happening thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love I think it's the same, or maybe I have the name different, but Caring Across Generations.
Yes. Yes.
I love the way that they are bringing together not just care providers, but also the people they care for.
Yes.
I think one of one of the tensions that I find hard to resolve in this debate is the tension between people who need the care and struggle to pay for it, and people who give the care and don't get paid enough or get enough benefits. I mean, I think it's very clear for me anyway, in the fight for domestic workers' rights, which I think is a pretty righteous cause, and it's exciting to see it making a lot of headway. But I do sympathize with middle-class parents who struggle to find and pay for quality childcare. And I think you can't focus on one side of the coin without the other. That's why I really love Caring Across Generations, because both sides of the coin come to their care congresses, their meetings. But I don't think a lot of policies take both sides into account.
Well, I think that's where the social science should come in and should I think, play a constructive role. That is that you want to acknowledge the distributional conflict. If wages of care workers go up, people have to pay more for care. But you also want to point out that the existing care economy is really inefficient. It's really fragmented. It's really it's just really inadequate in a variety of different ways. And so if we could just put our minds to it and design a kind of a more coherent system of social insurance to cover care provision, we'd all be better off.
Yeah, definitely. And whenever I talk about this issue, I talk about the fact that you really need government in the middle of the two sides, helping to both to ensure the rights and sort of base levels of fair pay and benefits, and also to subsidize and help provide for the quality care and training and things that come with that for the people who need the care on the other side. I don't really think there's a lot of other... I don't see any other way to do it except to have the government involved, particularly in subsidizing the care that enables so much of the economy to be moving, enables mothers to go into the workforce, parents in general, caretakers of elderly relatives. I don't see a private sector solution to that. I really see a public sector solution.
I do too, and I think the best way to frame it is in terms of social insurance, that we're all paying into a system that's providing a safety net, a backup, a way of distributing risk for people who need care and are giving care at different points in the life cycle. And so what we need to design is a social insurance system that is really is both simple and sustainable and adequate to meet our care needs.
Definitely. I really love the model in California and New Jersey for paid parental leave that has been designed as insurance, because I think that usually it gets talked about like a benefit where an individual company has to pay out wages to a new parent who needs to take time off. And they've designed it so it's the system that everybody pays into, similar to Social Security, and then you draw on those benefits when you need them. And it's probably pretty easy to assume that a lot of people will end up drawing upon that in their lifetimes at one point or another and really benefit from it. So again, it's sort of pooling the risk, pooling the provision of a desperately needed policy together to make it less about putting an individual company on the hook for paying a benefit.
Yeah, I think social insurance is really the way to frame it.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of men in care work, or the lack of men in care work. I have a couple questions for you. One is that you talked about how you didn't include healthcare just because that's its own sort of vast. It has its own issues going on probably right now. But when I was reading about all the different kinds of care work that we sort of bring together in that definition, I thought about doctors because doctors are similar to other care providers in that they're providing care that used to be done in the home, taking care of sick people, making them healthy again. Obviously now it's specialized and highly educated and skilled. And it's now an industry where men have lots of the jobs. I actually don't know the stats, but I'm pretty sure that they dominate those jobs, not nursing jobs, but doctors' jobs.
Actually, women have really moved into the medical profession. So if you look at the younger cohorts, that gender balance is really shifting.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah. Of course, but within medicine, women are more likely to go into pediatrics or family care rather than surgery or orthopedics.
Right. I do find it fascinating though that it has been sort of a male-dominated industry for a while, and even if it's becoming more equalized, it's a field that men feel comfortable going into.
Yeah.
Whereas most care work men don't seem to enter it. So my question is sort of twofold. I'm just curious about if you have thoughts as to why the medical profession seems to be different than other care work, and if there are others like that. That was the example.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I can't tell you how many debates I've had over the years with who we should define as care workers, and I have always argued in favor of including physicians and also college professors, being one myself, but. I do think that makes sense. I think that the quality of care, the quality of the service you get from a doctor or from a college professor is influenced by whether that doctor or college professor really cares about you or cares about your well-being. So that's kind of the way we define care work is work in which that sense of concern about somebody else really affects quality. I mean, what's different about those kinds of work is that if they involve more education, more training, more credentialization, and workers are in a better bargaining position in the labor market, and they get better wages and benefits.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe the education and training is a clue to why it's attractive, why it's probably held in higher esteem than, say, a home health aide or a domestic worker. Although if you think about teaching, I think that teaching on the elementary level is unfairly thought of as sort of like mid-skill work, but you have to usually have... It's very highly skilled. I was a teacher for 2 years, so I can attest that it's a really hard job.
Yeah, I agree.
Even beyond that, you usually need at least a master's to be a teacher. I think that, there are ways to be a teacher without a master's degree, but most jobs require that. So it's not even a low education job.
Right.
And yet women dominate it, and so I think we tend to think of it as low skill work, which is...
Yeah, there are all these, really interesting connections between traditional gender norms and the kind of inherited devaluation of women's work that really do shape compensation in the care sector.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And so I wonder also, during the recovery period, men have been moving into traditionally female jobs. Retail is a big one, but there have been some others. But it doesn't seem like that's necessarily happening with care work. I've talked to people at Domestic Workers United, and they're sort of like, no, men are not really entering this work in droves, even though it's a growing sector. So what keeps men out? Is it...
Well, really low wages... That's a pretty major factor, I would say. And I think, in fact, the lower the wages in care work, the fewer men tend to go into it. But in general, gender norms are very sticky in low-wage jobs.
Yeah.
You also see that in the kind of low rate of, men are unlikely to go into relatively low-wage care jobs, and women are also actually much less likely to go into traditionally male jobs that are at the bottom of the pay scale. So there's, I think, this really interesting interaction between gender and class that is shaping the whole structure of occupational segregation in the U.S.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, that sort of sounds like there is less incentive when there aren't higher wages to sort of go against society's expectations and enter on.
Well, I mean, it's a double whammy. I mean, it's a double whammy to go into a job that people look askance at because it's kind of gender non-conforming, gender threatening, and it doesn't pay that well,
right.
So, I actually think that helps explain why so many women are working so hard to get a college degree or a postgraduate degree. That you can, if you get enough education and you get into a really highly credentialed job, that kind of helps make up for the fact that you're violating a traditional gender norm. And so it's easier for women to cross occupational boundaries at the top than at the bottom of the occupational distribution. And it works
right.
the other way for men, that men, I think men who want to be nurses, they know they're going to take some cultural flack. On the other hand, they know that it's a growing job category with a lot of job security and that it's going to pay off. So they're more likely to be willing to take on the nurse thing.
Right. Whereas with most of the other sort of traditionally female work that tends to be lower pay and less valued, there's no pay. There's such little payoff for going against the grain.
Yeah.
That it's a real disincentive. Because I think that people only they tend to think about just the societal norms when they talk about why men won't become, child caretakers or whatever, or teachers or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And don't think as much about the pay side of it, which
right.
I think is huge. I mean,
yeah.
There's just so much less incentive to take a job that has low wages and low benefits.
Yeah.
Blue collar jobs, even if they're on the decline, traditionally have offered men, particularly men without a higher education, solid pay, great benefits, lots of stability. Why would you trade that for a crappy service sector job that offers none of those things?
Yeah.
So I understand it. So I have perhaps one more question that kept coming up in the back of my mind. I know a little bit less about the movement, but it's the wages for housework movement from the 70s.
Yeah.
Because you talk so much about value and care, and I think that one of the motivating factors to that movement was not just to compensate women for the work they do, but by paying for that work, forcing society to think of it as work and a tradable commodity. Do you see room for that in what you're pushing for? Does that is that a potential solution for some of the things? Is that fraught for you?
I think the whole wages for housework thing was a fascinating foray into this whole discussion about the relationship between paid and unpaid work. But it was always kind of unclear who was going to pay the wages. And in the original formulation, the idea was that employers should pay wages for housework because the women who were tending to domestic duties and taking care of family for male workers were actually, producing the labor power that was winning that wage. But, it was never a great idea to charge employers more for workers with a family than those without, because for one thing, it would have discouraged people from hiring workers who had families to take care of. So I think, the whole wages for housework issue is kind of morphed now much more into an issue of public support and of social insurance and of collective commitment to developing our capabilities. And it's also, I think, shifted away from the kind of concept of wages. I mean, there's something about wages, something about the idea that you're going to pay people purely on an hourly basis for what they do that violates the sense that it's a job, it's a responsibility that extends beyond a kind of hourly metric. And so, when I provide a replacement cost estimate of the value of unpaid care, in some ways I'm using that metaphor. I'm using an hourly wage to impute the value of that unpaid work. But I'm always emphasizing that it's a lower bound. It's a minimum cost. It's a back of the envelope calculation, not one that we would necessarily want to use to remunerate people. And so I think I think somehow what we need to do is develop public programs and social insurance systems that reward people for taking on care responsibilities. But I don't think we want to suggest that that's something you could do by punching a time card.
Yeah. The other question I always had about it was, given gender norms around care work and the fact that, house upkeeping and also childcare just default to women overwhelmingly still. Even with women having entered the workforce, we're still doing more housework and domestic work. If you're paying for those duties, does that just reinforce that system? Because does that just... I didn't see how we were going to undo the fact that women were going to still be the default people to stay home and not be in the labor force.
Yeah.
And so even if we're not dealing with wages for housework, if we're dealing with other ways of compensation, it seems to me that that's a really big question and something to keep in mind as policies are developed.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And, there have been a lot of really passionate debates about that dilemma, about that paradox, especially among feminist economists. I think that it kind of cuts both ways. And you have to be aware of that, and you have to design, policies or programs that really encourage people to combine paid and unpaid work. I think we don't want policies that encourage women or anyone to totally specialize in unpaid care. What we want to do is, and I really believe this, and I think most people actually are drawn to the idea that they want to both have interesting and important paid work responsibilities, but they also want to have time to take care of their friends and their family and their children and their parents. And I think looking for ways to make it easier for people to do that will literally pay off.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think also I've had very interesting conversations with friends who are mothers, and there's a strong feeling that women have some sort of natural inclination towards caring for children. And I'm just not sure I subscribe to that worldview. I think that fathers are amazing caretakers when they have the time and devote the energy. And it's more that we don't expect it of them and or give them the opportunity to do it, the time and the resources to do it. But I think that there's still a feeling among many people that this is sort of a natural, that women are going to have a natural inclination towards this work no matter what.
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that caring is kind of addictive. That is, once you start caring for someone, it's very hard to stop. And that makes sense. You build a relationship. So the more time you spend caring for people, the more attached you tend to become to them. And I think that helps explain a lot of why traditional social norms are difficult to change, because you assign women responsibility for care, so they do more caring, so they become, more attached to the caregiving role. And it takes a little bit takes some cultural effort and renegotiation to change that. But once you do, the good news is that once you do, I think caring becomes a much more gender neutral commitment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've seen evidence that when parental leave is both offered to men and women and paid, so that it's much more likely people can actually take it, that men will take it, and then there is evidence that when they take it and they spend time with their children, particularly at that critical age, they form a really intense bond and tend to be much more involved for the rest of the child's life. So it's like once you get them to do it, they keep doing it on their own. Yeah, and there's, like you're saying, it's addictive.
And there is evidence from time use surveys that fathers are spending more time with their kids. Mm-hmm. And fathers report wanting to spend more time with their kids and wanting to have more workplace flexibility so they can do that.
Yeah, which is great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. That's a good place to stop. Thank you so much for joining me. This was really fantastic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with you, Bryce, and I hope we'll stay in touch.
Definitely. Thanks so much.
Okay.